Years old when I started to lose my sight, and I finished the job when I was maybe 7.
Frank Sinatra called him a genius. Billy Joel called him more important than Elvis Presley. Country singer Glen Campbell sang at his funeral. So what kind of performer gets this wide variety of attention? The answer is Ray Charles, the crossover king. Charles had his hands in all kinds of music styles, and in his spare time was enmeshed in his fair share of scandal. Oh, did I mention he was also blind? Keep watching to see how this complex, multi-talented, and occasionally infuriating man became known as the crossover king, as now, 20 years after he died, his family finally confirms the rumors. Before we dive into the rumors, let's take a look at his journey to see how the events in Ray's life shaped him into the person he became. Ray Charles came from humble beginnings, but his early life was far from simple. Born on September 30th, 1930, in Albany, Georgia, Ray's entrance into the world was tied to a complicated and painful family history. His mother, Aretha Robinson, had faced unimaginable hardship from a young age. After losing her own mother, Aretha's father couldn't care for her, so he handed her over to his boss, Bailey Robinson, and his wife, Mary, with the promise they would raise her as their own. However, that promise was shattered. By the time Aretha was just a teenager, she became pregnant, and the circumstances were even more tragic. The father of her child was none other than her adoptive father, Bailey Robinson. This scandal turned Aretha's world upside down, forcing her to flee from the household to live with her aunts and uncles. It was with them that she gave birth to her son, Ray Charles Robinson. But Aretha's next move left many bewildered. Despite the trauma she had endured, she made the difficult decision to return to the very home where the assault had taken place. Bailey, sensing the tension, soon left the scene, while Aretha and Mary Robinson, the wife of her attacker, settled into an uneasy arrangement. Together, they raised young Ray Charles in what must have been a strained and complicated environment. At just 3 years old, Ray Charles found himself spending time at Wiley Pittman's Red Wing Cafe, a small spot where locals would gather. Pittman, a family friend, loved playing the piano, favoring the boogie-woogie style that was popular at the time. It didn't take long for people to notice how captivated young Ray was by the music. Pittman, seeing this spark, took Ray under his wing and started teaching him to play the piano. Little did Pittman know, he was nurturing a talent that would one day change the world of music. But before Ray could rise to fame, his young life was filled with unimaginable heartache. At the tender age of 5, Ray witnessed a devastating tragedy that would stay with him forever. His baby brother George was left unattended during bath time, and as Ray stood nearby, he helplessly watched as George slipped into the water. Unable to act, Ray could do nothing but witness the horrifying scene unfold as his brother drowned in front of his eyes. It was a loss that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Shortly after that heartbreaking moment, Ray faced another crushing blow. His eyesight began to fail. By the time he was 7, Ray had lost his sight completely, adding another layer of hardship to his already difficult life. The Robinson family was desperately poor, and his mother, Aretha, now had to face the monumental task of raising a blind child while still grieving the loss of her youngest son. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Ray had not one but 2 strong women looking out for him. During this period, Ray Charles and his mother were still living with Mary Robinson, the former wife of Ray's father. Mary, whom Ray affectionately called Mother, provided a more nurturing and indulgent presence in his life. But it was his biological mother, Aretha Robinson, known as Mama, who had a different vision for her son. Despite his blindness, she was determined to make him independent. Aretha, who had no formal education and very little money, set out on an almost impossible mission: to find her blind son a proper education. Had she not succeeded, Ray's future might have been very different. After an exhaustive search, Aretha discovered the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind in St. Augustine. When Ray was just 7, the school accepted him, and fortunately for Ray, it had a music program. There, he was introduced to classical music at an early age, sparking the passion that would later define his career. However, one glaring challenge remained. How could a blind child read sheet music? Enter Mrs. Lawrence, Ray's teacher, who introduced him to an intricate and demanding method. She taught Ray how to read Braille music, where what he read with his right hand had to be played on the piano with his left hand, and vice versa. This process was as difficult as it sounds, but Ray, even as a child, mastered it, revealing early signs of the musical genius that would later captivate the world. While he initially focused on the piano, his teachers expanded his repertoire to include the saxophone, clarinet, and trumpet. Additionally, he mastered the art of composing music in Braille. By the age of 12, Charles had developed an exceptional talent. He could independently arrange and write scores for big band music. However, his time at school was marked by an even more profound experience, one that was not part of the curriculum. In his biography, Charles revealed that at the age of 12, he entered into a relationship with an older woman. While many might view this as a troubling episode, Charles later reflected on it as a significant life passage. Despite his achievements at school, Charles faced immense personal tragedy. At 14, while still attending the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind, he received devastating news. His mother, whom he referred to as his guiding light, had passed away. This loss was a profound blow to Charles, who later recounted that the deaths of his brother and mother were the greatest tragedies of his life, surpassing even the loss of his eyesight. After his mother's burial, Charles made a courageous decision that would shape his future. Although Ray Charles never really knew his father, he eventually learned of his passing, leaving him with no immediate family at just 15 years old. Alone in the world, Charles packed up his belongings and made his way to Jacksonville, Florida, where he moved in with a friend of his late mother. To survive, he took whatever gigs he could find, playing with local bands and making a mere $4 a night, equivalent to roughly $41 today. Despite the meager pay, Charles knew that staying in Florida wouldn't get him where he needed to go. Ray had bigger dreams, but was cautious about where to pursue them. The sprawling music scenes of New York and Chicago seemed overwhelming to the young musician, who feared he might get lost in the shuffle. Instead, he set his sights on Seattle, a city that felt more approachable for a budding artist. Little did he know, this decision would change the course of his life. Upon arriving in Seattle, Charles crossed paths with another 15-year-old musical prodigy, Quincy Jones. At the time, no one could have predicted that these two teenagers would go on to shape the future of American music. But before Ray Charles could make it big, he had to start small. By the age of 19, Charles had formed a trio called Mexon, a blend of his partner's name, McKee, and his own surname at the time, Robinson. Mexon played the late-night shift at a local bar called the Rocking Chair, performing from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. Despite the grueling hours, the trio managed to make a name for themselves, eventually landing a national hit record. Things were looking up for Charles, and that's when he took another kind of hit, getting into drugs. We'll soon see how this casual use would lead to some major trouble for Charles. Ray Charles's breakout hit, Confession Blues, opened doors for him, leading to a series of performance dates at a Miami hotel. However, instead of staying at the same hotel where he was performing, Charles was directed to stay elsewhere. The reason was not due to his newfound fame or a preference for a more luxurious accommodation. In fact, it was far more troubling. In 1950, racial segregation laws dictated that Charles stay in Overtown, Florida, a neighborhood designated for Black Americans. Despite facing these humiliating circumstances, Charles remained focused on advancing his career. Soon after, Ray Charles signed with Atlantic Records, and his success continued to soar as he churned out hit after hit. However, in 1954, his career faced a significant setback with the release of I've Got a Woman. Charles claimed credit for the song's composition, but his bandmate took credit for the lyrics. The public, however, was quick to recognize the melody from another song. It turned out that Charles had borrowed the melody from It Must Be Jesus by the Southern Tones. This caused trouble for two major reasons. First, there was the issue of artistic integrity. Charles was accused of taking credit for someone else's work, but more scandalously, he had transformed a religious song into something far more secular. The original song, dedicated to Jesus, was reinterpreted by Charles in a way that was deemed irreverent by preachers and their congregations, causing an uproar. Despite the backlash, Ray Charles was onto something groundbreaking. While he wasn't the first artist to blend blues with gospel, he brought a unique flair to this fusion, his own distinctive style. Charles developed a signature sound that captivated the music-loving public. He no longer shied away from acknowledging his borrowings from gospel music. For instance, he transformed the gospel classic This Little Light of Mine into his own version, This Little Girl of Mine, showcasing his knack for reinterpreting traditional tunes. However, while Charles was experimenting with musical genres, he was also exploring darker territories in his personal life. After experimenting with marijuana, he quickly moved on to more potent substances, opiates. Although the exact timeline of his drug use is unclear, it became evident when authorities apprehended him in 1955. They found him backstage with cannabis and, more alarmingly, with paraphernalia linked to intravenous drug use. Charles was detained, but this incident did little to curb his addiction, which was now well established. Amidst his hectic touring schedule and substance abuse, Charles managed to marry twice. His first marriage was to Eileen Williams, which lasted only a year. His second marriage, however, proved to be more enduring. He married Della Beatrice Howard, whom he affectionately called B in 1955. The couple had met in Texas in 1954 and tied the knot the following year. In the same year they married, they welcomed their son, Ray Charles Robinson, Jr. But with Charles's demanding career and ongoing addiction, the future of this marriage was fraught with uncertainty. Despite grappling with personal issues and the demands of a growing family, Ray Charles's career continued to thrive. He performed at prominent black venues like the Apollo Theater, as well as prestigious locations such as Carnegie Hall. In 1958, recognizing the need for a distinctive backing vocal group, Charles acquired the all-female group The Cookies and rebranded them as the Raelettes to become his exclusive backup singers. During one performance that same year, Charles faced a challenge. After completing their set list, he and the Raelettes still had 12 minutes left to fill. Seizing the opportunity for some spontaneous creativity, Charles signaled the Raelettes to follow his lead as he began to improvise on the keyboard. He started generating random lyrics on the spot, and the Raelettes responded in kind. The audience's enthusiastic reaction was so intense that Charles could literally feel the room vibrating with excitement. Seeing the overwhelming response, Charles decided to record the improvised piece. The result was What Did I Say?, which was recorded in a small, cramped studio at Atlantic Records. While Charles was confident that the track would be a hit, producers were less certain, primarily because they considered the song's content to be rather risque. The lyrics of What Did I Say weren't the primary concern. Any explicit phrases like, shake that thing, could be easily edited out. The real issue was the suggestive moans and groans from Charles and the Raelettes, which he compared to the sweet sounds of love. While these sounds might have been sweet, they were far from radio-friendly in 1959. Additionally, the song's length posed a problem. The recording engineer came up with a clever solution, splitting the track into two parts. What Did I Say Part 1 was a more restrained version, clocking in at 3:05 and cutting off before the more explicit content. What Did I Say Part 2 was shorter and much more provocative, catering to listeners at home. This division provided both a radio-friendly version and a more daring one. Surprisingly, this raunchy, improvised track became Ray Charles's breakthrough hit. What Did I Say was notable for its fusion of gospel and rumba, creating a novel genre, soul music. It was the first song officially categorized as soul, and it was met with overwhelming enthusiasm from black audiences. Equally surprising was its impact on white listeners, who began to take notice of Charles for the first time. With What Did I Say, Charles had made a successful crossover into mainstream music, and his rise to fame was unstoppable. As Ray Charles and the Raylettes gained fame for their innovative sound, scandal was brewing behind the scenes. In the same year that Charles released What Did I Say, he began an affair with Margie Hendricks, a member of the Raylettes. Despite being married to B, Charles and Hendricks's relationship became a hot topic when, in 1959, they had a child together. Hendricks hoped Charles would leave B and build a life with her and their son, but Charles had no intention of abandoning his wife. While Charles navigated his turbulent personal life, he faced challenges in his professional world as well. His contract with Atlantic Records had expired, providing him with an opportunity to switch to ABC Paramount. This move proved lucrative, offering him higher royalties, substantial advances, and, crucially, ownership of his master tapes. With his new deal, Charles enjoyed success with hits like Georgia on My Mind and Hit the Road Jack. However, his career's momentum was marred by recurring legal issues related to his drug use. Following his 1955 arrest, law enforcement apprehended him again in 1958 on a Harlem street corner. This was followed by another arrest 3 years later in an Indiana hotel room. Charles admitted that his addiction had begun at age 16, and despite his soaring career, his persistent legal troubles threatened to undermine his success. In 1961, Ray Charles had a performance lined up for a dance party in Augusta, Georgia. Just before he was set to start, he learned that the venue had a segregation policy. The larger auditorium would be reserved for white patrons, while black attendees would be relegated to the balcony. Charles was adamant about not accepting such discriminatory practices. When the venue refused to change the policy, Charles took a stand and canceled the concert. This act of defiance had a significant impact. Although Charles faced a $757 fine for the cancellation, his actions contributed to change. By 1963, when Charles returned to Augusta, the auditorium had been desegregated, allowing him to perform to an integrated audience. His impact on the city was later immortalized with a statue unveiled in his honor, depicting him at the piano. However, not all of Charles's experiences were as triumphant. On one occasion, while traveling in a small plane between Oklahoma City and Louisiana, disaster struck. The pilot had neglected to use the defroster, causing the windshield to quickly ice over. As the ice accumulated, visibility deteriorated to zero. In a grim twist of fate, the pilot found himself as blind as his passenger. The pilot of Ray Charles's small plane struggled to maintain control as he circled, hoping the windshield would clear enough to provide visibility. Eventually, a small break in the ice offered a glimpse through the frozen glass, allowing him to land the plane safely. Once on solid ground, Charles had a profound moment of reflection. He viewed the harrowing experience as a spiritual awakening, an opportunity to assess the man he had become. At that point in his life, he was deeply entangled in drug addiction and womanizing. Despite this epiphany, the moment of clarity did not lead to immediate change. During this period, Charles was managing relationships with both Raylette Margie Hendricks and his wife, B. In 1963, he began a new relationship with Mae Mosley Lyles, another singer in the Raylettes. This affair led to the birth of a daughter, baby Renee, in 1961. 2 years later, Charles's personal life became even more complicated with the birth of another daughter, this time with Sandra Jean Betts. Charles's penchant for relationships and his juggling act became almost a full-time job. Margie Hendricks struggled with her position in Charles's life as she and their son were often sidelined. Despite continuing to perform as a backup singer for Charles, Hendrix's personal struggles with alcohol and drug use intensified. Their tumultuous relationship came to a head in 1964 during a European tour when a major argument led to Charles firing her from the Raylettes. Tragically, Hendrix's life unraveled further, and she passed away at the age of 38 less than a decade later. During this turbulent period, Charles faced renewed struggles with addiction, culminating in a significant legal setback. In a stark reminder of his ongoing battle, Charles was detained by authorities at Logan Airport in Boston for drug-related offenses. Realizing the gravity of his situation, he made a decisive move by checking into rehab. Demonstrating remarkable determination, Charles managed to go cold turkey for 4 days. Once he was clean, he had to confront the legal consequences of his actions. Charles's brief stint in rehab impressed the judge, but the prosecution remained unsatisfied. They demanded a 2-year prison sentence and a substantial fine. In a turn of events, Charles's psychiatrist, Dr. Hacker, provided a compelling account of Charles's struggle with addiction, which moved the judge. As a result, the judge decided to impose a different kind of sentence. Charles was required to undergo regular medical examinations by a government doctor for 1 year to verify his sobriety. With his record clean after a year, Charles returned to court. The judge, recognizing Charles's efforts to overcome his addiction, showed compassion. Charles received a suspended sentence of 5 years, a $10,000 fine, and probation for 4 years. This outcome was a significant relief for Charles. In a gesture reflecting his relief and renewed vigor, he promptly released 2 hit singles, Let's Get Stoned and I Don't Need No Doctor. Despite this victory over his addiction, Charles found that one bad habit remained stubbornly resistant to change. Ray Charles was candid about his voracious appetite for women. His relationships were numerous, spanning both before, during, and after his marriage-to-be. Charles had a particular preference for women who were older and, to be diplomatic, not conventionally attractive. He believed that beautiful women often carried an air of entitlement, assuming they were doing him a favor with their attention. Consequently, he gravitated toward women who did not fit traditional standards of beauty. Despite his relentless pursuit of romantic relationships, the public's infatuation with Charles's music began to wane in the early 1970s. The era's musical tastes shifted towards hard and psychedelic rock, leaving Charles's once dominant sound in the background. Although he continued to record, his popularity suffered a noticeable decline. His gospel-style rendition of America the Beautiful was a bold move that further divided his audience. The dramatic reinterpretation of this beloved patriotic song upset some fans, who felt it was a sacrilegious departure from tradition. Though his career seemed to be on a downturn, Charles found a way to rejuvenate his spirit. During this period, he frequently traveled between concerts using a chartered jet. The pilot of the jet, a devoted fan of Charles, made the flights memorable by occasionally broadcasting a special announcement over the intercom, Charles's name. Recognizing the cue, Charles would eagerly rush up to the cockpit, delighted by the pilot's enthusiasm and the personalized touch. Once in the cockpit of the small plane, Ray Charles took on an extraordinary challenge. He piloted the aircraft. This was a feat that most blind individuals would never attempt, let alone achieve. Charles himself acknowledged the inherent dangers of this activity and was careful not to encourage others with vision impairments to follow suit, knowing the risks involved. While Charles enjoyed these flights, his bandmates were far from comfortable with his in-cockpit adventures. They felt an acute sense of anxiety whenever Charles took the control, but they were unaware of a more alarming reality. The pilot, despite his professional training, would allow Charles to do something even riskier: land the plane. The audacity required to land a plane without sight is staggering, but Charles demonstrated a remarkable skill. There were times when he was arguably a more adept pilot than the trained professionals. However, in 1985, an incident occurred that highlighted the true peril of these flights. During a private jet flight to Monroe County Airport in Indiana, the conditions were dire due to torrential rain. As the plane attempted to land, the pilot lost control. The aircraft skidded across the wet runway, slid down a hill, and eventually came to a halt in a field. Remarkably, Charles, who was absorbed in a game of chess as the crash unfolded, was among those taken to the hospital. Fortunately, despite the severity of the situation, there were no serious injuries sustained by those on board. By the mid-1970s, Ray Charles had shifted away from writing his own music and found himself constantly searching for new material to record. During this period, Arlette Kochounian, a Parisian singer-songwriter, managed to secure a meeting with Charles, clutching a record of a song she believed would be perfect for him. Charles showed interest in the song, but he was equally captivated by Kochounian herself. In 1977, Charles and Kochounian welcomed a son into the world. This new relationship was a continuation of Charles's notorious womanizing habits, and it marked a breaking point for his long-suffering wife, Bea. Despite enduring years of infidelity, addiction issues, and a peripatetic lifestyle, Bea had reached her limit. The birth of Charles's child with Kochounian was the final straw. By 1977, Bea had grown weary of his erratic behavior and constant absences due to touring. The strains on their marriage had become insurmountable, and Bea decided to end their 22-year union. For Charles, who had never been faithful to a single partner, this divorce was a significant blow. As Charles approached the later stages of his life, he began to reflect on his legacy and the future of his children. Having fathered 12 children with 9 different women, Charles wanted to ensure they were well provided for. In a gesture of reconciliation and responsibility, he organized a luncheon for all his children. At this gathering, Charles announced that he had a substantial gift for each of them, $500,000. This was his way of preparing for the end of his life. Despite having managed to overcome his addiction to harder drugs, Ray Charles continued to indulge in other harmful substances throughout his life. He maintained a daily routine of drinking a bottle of gin and consuming what he referred to as large quantities of marijuana. Charles once boasted that his substance use never interfered with his ability to perform, a claim that may have held some truth, but it certainly took a toll on his health. In 2003, shortly after undergoing hip surgery, Charles received concerning news from his doctor. He was suffering from liver disease and hepatitis C. Faced with these serious health issues, Charles made the difficult decision to cancel his upcoming tour. The progression of his illness ultimately led to his death on June 10, 2004, at his Beverly Hills home. He was 73 years old. Charles's passing was marked by a grand, star-studded funeral. The service featured performances by some of the greatest names in music, including B.B. King, Stevie Wonder, Wynton Marsalis, and country legend Glen Campbell.